morning. I will be reading from 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 to 12. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by men, but chosen by God, and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in scriptures it says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame." Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the capstone, and a stone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, and that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as aliens and strangers in the world, to abstain from sinful desires, which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us.
I think it's always important for us to take time to think about passages like 1 Peter 2, 4 to 12. It's a beautiful passage when you think about it. It relates to the idea of who we are. You know, sometimes Christians have a way of thinking, or at least some do, in a way that kind of seems like, like poor me, I'm hard done by, feeling like nobody in the world, and it's kind of, there's a passage that talks about the idea that really, Paul, I think writing to Corinthians, uses the idea that, that before we were Christians, many were nobodies. We're not people of significance. And there's kind of a tendency to carry that thinking on. So I want to spend our time this morning thinking about this passage because I don't know how you can read it and not really get stirred by it. So, 1 Peter, the book, a letter from Peter. He begins, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. So, we know pretty specifically who wrote this book. We tend to think of him as one of the great apostles, don't we? He's one of Peter, James, John, one of that seems to be the inner circle, the apostles that were at events even the other apostles were not. We think of Peter as sharing some very special moments with Jesus and having a very important role in the early church. He's the one who preaches the first gospel sermon in Acts chapter 2. So, as you think about that, just to remember that when Paul was converted, there was a suspicion about him among the apostles. And so Paul goes to Jerusalem, meets with the apostles. They talk about what they're preaching and what they're doing. And the apostles, Paul says, extend the right hand of fellowship to Paul, but then suggest that, Paul's ministry has directed him toward Gentiles. And they say, so you go toward the Gentiles and we will preach to the Jews. And so you have a complementary ministry that's going on, that they're reaching out to both. And that's kind of important. So as they are going around the empire preaching, that there is a thing that we call the diaspora. And that's the term for the fact that many of the Jewish people were scattered throughout the empire. You know, if you go back to Acts chapter 2 to the day of Pentecost, you'll find a listing that Pentecost was a pilgrimage feast. There were Jews from all over the empire there, and there's a listing of all the places where they're from. That's kind of, it's really interesting how the Jewish people, like, there are many who live in what kind of the traditional homeland of the Jews there in Palestine, but there are many who live elsewhere. And so the task of preaching to the Jews and the Gentiles around the empire is really great. And so the apostles kind of undertake that especially. So the letter that he writes here is addressed to God's elect. And, I thought, we could do a whole sermon on election here. We're not going to do that. But these are people that God's chosen in the sense that when the gospel is preached, there are people who believe and who enter a very special relationship with Him. They are people who are strangers in the world. And we see different passages that refer to Christians as aliens and strangers, sojourners, foreigners, that just kind of remind us that we live in an environment that really isn't our. You think about the Jewish diaspora. For example, think about Jewish people that have ended up in places like Rome and Athens. It's a totally foreign, alien culture to their background and their faith. And the same thing for Christians. That the more they grow as Christians, the more they come to realize that they feel like they don't really belong where they are. That there are some astounding differences that occur. And so, Peter is addressing believers in the different nations where they have been spread. Some because people have gone around preaching the gospel. Some because, for example, there were all those people in Jerusalem at Pentecost, and many of those that became Christians have returned home. And so, it's interesting how, as we see through Paul's travels, that sometimes he comes to a place and there are already Christians there. Places that he hasn't come to work there. Well, why? Well, because other Christians have carried the gospel back home with them or have carried it as they traveled. And so, Peter's letter, we refer to as a general epistle because, he's writing not to a specific place, and if you look here at the very beginning, you'll see him mention some of the different places where they are. But likely he's writing to all Christians, not just to the Jewish Christians. Because the same situation is true, and there are some things that he says that are probably more true of the Gentiles than of the Jewish Christians. Like, once you were not a people, now you're the people of God. Well, the Jews already thought they were the people of God. But for the Gentiles, that would be something new or different. But one of the important themes in this letter, and there are many different ideas in it, but one of the important themes is the idea of how you represent Christ. How you live as a Christian in a non-Christian world or a non-Christian community, or if even I could go so far as to say an anti-Christian culture. Because it's very, many people in the empire were very hostile to Christians. And just to note that it's not going to be very long after Peter wrote this letter that he is going to be executed in Rome. So, how do you do that? Okay. We're going to skip the rest of chapter 1, move into chapter 2. We didn't read the first 3 verses, but in the first 3 verses, he's saying, put off or rid yourself. There are these moral challenges that Peter raises through the letter. And for us, maybe it's kind of hard to imagine the need to tell Christians to put off malice. See, what's malice? It's hatred. Deceit. lying to one another, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. So the chapter begins with this challenge that you need to, and this is very much like Paul writing to his different audiences to say, okay, we might sum it up by saying, clean up your act. Get it? But I think Peter has a really neat way to say it when he gets to the end. And so he says, crave for pure spiritual milk. Crave for the Word of God. Look for those things that are going to help you grow. And we would say, okay, spend time in Bible study, spend time in prayer, spend time in worship, spend time in fellowship. Because living in a hostile environment, it's very easy to become influenced by that environment. And Peter's point here is to say, you need to lead lives that influence the people around you. Don't be influenced by the behavior of those who are not Christians. And so the transition phrase here, it begins in verse 4, is as you come to Him. As you come to Christ. Well, in one sense, as Christians, they've already come to Him. But there's a sense that, isn't it true that we are always coming to Christ? That we're always learning to listen to Him, learn from Him, follow Him. So, now, verses 4 through 12. What's interesting to me is 3 times in these verses, he uses the word precious. I don't hear many people use the word precious anymore. Maybe, you'll hear somebody looking at a newborn or a young baby and just caught up in just the innocence and the simplicity and the wonder of that little child, the beauty of that little child may say, oh, isn't he or isn't she precious? Or we might hear it used in terms of reference to what we refer to as precious stones. Gems. Diamonds, for example. But Peter is using this here in the idea of come to Him, that living stone. Now, I'll go ahead and say something here. I've had discussions with people over the years, because there are 2 references here. One of them is to a foundation stone, the other is to a capstone. Foundation stone is like the cornerstone. There's a cornerstone just outside here as you go around toward the front doors. And you'll see a big stone there with the date that the original building was put up. But then you think about the capstone, which is the stone, like you think about arches that are made, and the capstone is really the stone that holds the arch together. The point is not about the specific place of the stone, although there are arguments there, but the idea is that it's a foundational, or it's an important stone. It's an indispensable thing for the building. But this is a stone that has been rejected by man. And the contrast in here is between stones that are precious to people, valuable, important, and stones that are rejected. And you could just see, when we were renovating this building and the heating and cooling system was being changed, many of you didn't see it, but there was a great big hole cut in the floor back there, just in front of the balcony. Huge hole. And as the concrete was cut out, then they started digging down in. And guess what? These big Tyndall blocks were found in there. I mean, how many homes in Winnipeg have Tyndall on them? It's It's not a precious stone like diamonds, but it's a valuable stone. But the crazy thing was, trying to dig down there to make room for the vents and the ductwork, and these great big blocks of stone down there, well, these stones were rejected. They couldn't be used in the building, and so they were just dumped in a hole. And then the floor was poured over them. Well, that's kind of the image that Peter is using here, that the builders working on this temple that he's talking about from a human standpoint looked at this stone, the Jewish religious leaders, and said, "Nah, we don't want that one. Throw it away." And yet, it's chosen and precious to God. That's verses 4 and 6. That's what you're coming to, Peter says. And in verse 7 then, as believers, for those who believe, Jesus is precious. Now, the word that's translated as precious comes from a Greek word that means to honor, to esteem, to value, and in some cases especially the idea of highly. And so in this case, it is the idea of valuing highly this stone. It's a stone unlike any other stone that you could build with. And, it's being used to build this house of worship and sacrifice to God, but it's the stone on which we build our lives, isn't it? It's Jesus. It's the critical stone that we would not want to live without. I'm going to go ahead and say it. As I've been working on my lesson this week, that word precious has been going through my head, and unfortunately it's Gollum from C.S. Lewis's Lord of the Rings. But C.S. Lewis was a good friend of Tolkien. And so C.S. Lewis wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is one kind of fantasy. And Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, which was another kind of fantasy. But, you think about what would Gollum do for the ring? He'd lie. He'd cheat. He'd steal. He thought about murder. And didn't he bite off Frodo's finger to get the ring? I mean, we kind of laugh about, and you're probably hearing that voice, and I'm not going to imitate it, of Gollum, wanting his precious. But I think Peter's point is for us, it's like we sing that song, "As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you." That this precious stone is something that we desire great. Well, why is it precious for us? Okay, we'll just touch on a few things here. That number one, it gives us place. That these stones that he's talking about are being built into a temple, to a place where God is served. We are the stones that make up that temple with Jesus as the cornerstone. It gives us relationship with God. It gives us a priesthood. It's interesting to understand that in the Old Testament, there was a separate category of human beings that were called priests. They were the mediators between God and human beings. They represented God to the people and the people to God. In the New Testament, Christ has made every Christian a priest, has empowered each of us to approach God ourselves, to serve Him, to worship Him, to pray to Him. That's powerful. Because you don't get your relationship with God through me. Aren't you thankful? The stone gives us identity, tells us who we are, and we'll talk about that. So, who are we? All right. Well, Peter has a series of ideas here that are just, okay. Number one, you go back to the very beginning. We are God's chosen. We are His elect. Remember the old Speedy muffler? You know, it's Speedy or somebody. Well, we become somebody because of Jesus. We become those priests. We become those stones. That there's something special being able to go through life knowing that I'm God's person. Now, think about what that means. Everywhere I go, everything I do, every person I talk to, I'm a representative of God. You know, maybe you see yourself, you know, sometimes losing your cool at some clerk in a store. You're a representative of God. That's not you. That's not what you are. You're His representative. You're the means by which that person could come to know God. You don't want to shut that door by bad behavior, do you? Secondly, a royal priesthood. And what's interesting is that there are some adjectives with these terms. A royal priesthood. You know, you think back in the ancient world that there were priests who served the people, but there were special priests who served the kings, the royalty. You have all the dignity that would represent. You're a holy nation. Holy means you've been set apart. You know, one of the things in the religious world, the concept of saint has become totally distorted from the biblical concept. In the Bible, a person who is a Christian is a saint. You know, go look at some of Paul's letters. He addresses the saints in Ephesus, in Corinth. You know, these are God's people. That's what that means. And that means that sometimes what we expect of the word holy means a person who's set apart. The word that's translated as saint could be simply translated as a holy person. A person of God. That goes back again to that idea we're talking about, the chosen people, that we are God's representatives in the world. But we're His saints. We're unique. That's why the world looks at us sometimes the way that it does. And he says that we're a people belonging to God. So that as we go into the world, into the community, there's never a moment, think about it, there's never a moment that we are not God's person. There's never a moment that we're not representing God. So, what that means, it's how we live for God. You know, you think about all those expressions that Peter has used that give us these statements of identity. That translates into the way we live and the kind of people that we are. Therefore, how we live in the world. We are different. God expects us to be different. You know, sometimes we feel like, well, we can just have attitudes and we can lose our tempers and we can have the road rage and we can be just like everybody else. You know, if you think about what Peter is saying here, we're God's people. We're unique in the world. And so, you take the Christian and you take the person in the world and you put them side by side, and the words Peter uses is the Christians come across like aliens and strangers. And sometimes people will look at Christians. Some of you may have had the experience of somebody saying, "Are you for real?" Do you realize what that person just said to you or did to you? And you can respond peacefully and calmly? That you can be nice and forgiving and loving and gentle? Yeah? Because that's what God has called you to be as His person, as His saint. Remember, His kingdom. And so, in that line then, Peter says, abstain from sinful desires that wage war against your soul. Don't become like the world around you. Don't take on those bad attitudes or the actions. And I think one of the most powerful statements here, verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans. Isn't that it? The way he words that, and I'm not going to trust my memory here. Live such good lives among the pagans, and that is among the nations, among the unbelievers. You can put every word you want there. If pagan sounds a little too judgmental. But it's the idea of the people who don't know God. So, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of wrongdoing, see, the people of the world are going to slander Christians. They're going to speak against them. They're going to say things that are unfair and untrue because they're threatened by the kind of life that Christians lead and by the character that they display. So live such good lives that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. We need to have more influence on the people around us than they have on us. We need to lead lives that challenge people to righteousness. I'm not saying you preach at them and harp at them and say, oh, you shouldn't do it. You know what? If we do what's right and good, those people will see us. They may not like it. They may say, oh, you're nothing but a goody two-shoes. I know that's an old term. But it may be just that, they will do everything they can to discredit what we are. But deep down inside, they're going to respect us. And at some point, Lord willing, they will say to us, why are you the way that you are? I don't understand how you can take that guff. I don't understand how you can keep doing good. And at that point, we can say, well, because of Jesus. Glenn's going to lead us in a closing song here. It's about our relationship with Him. Think about that stone that the religious leaders and that many of the people rejected. It's a stone worth building into. Let's stand.